I said this earlier, like if you took 1,000 guys, like this is common in USAPL, and they're all looking at the best guy and they're like, well, you just squats and benches and deadlifts, so I'm going to just do SBD. Well, if you took 1,000 guys and you did what everyone else does, who's going to win? The person with the best genetics. Do you have the best genetics? It's like, it's probably not a very satisfying choice. So I've always felt like, well, I mean, even competing, and I would say I have good genetics and I have good mental toughness and I have a good work ethic. All the guys I compete against that I want to beat, they have all those things and probably better than me. So if I do the same thing that they do, I'm not going to beat them. So for me, I always felt it was important, one, that you can sort of find the secondary lifts that can build up your leverage points, maybe more quads or more back strength or more triceps. But better yet, if you have something that you do and you know it works and you know that the other guys don't do that, well, now you have an edge because you say, well, if I get better at this, there's a chance now that I could be better than them. So for me, I always did a lot of stiff leg deficit deadlifts. And people don't want to do those because they suck. And I did a lot of front squatting and people don't want to do those, but they work. And if I got better at them, I mean, I'm getting better at my main lifts. And if you're not doing at them, that gives me a mental edge. Or if, you do them and you're like, this is too hard. It's like, that's giving me that double edge of like, I got better and I know mentally that you're not doing it. So, that's obvious to me that if you do the same thing as everybody else and they have better genetics, I mean, because lottery wise, like, you probably don't have the best genetics. You've got to do something that's a little bit more specialized for yourself. So for each lift, you probably need, I always felt like you need like 4 or 5 or 6 kind of secondary lifts that work really well for you. And they might not be the ones that work, for you, that work for me. But like for me, I always, when it came to training rows, I had this one chest supported row that worked great. I would do dumbbell rows. They worked great for me. Pull-ups. I was doing a lot of body weight from a bar rows. And then really later on, I added in like the chest supported dumbbell rows. So that's 5 rows that I felt like these ones worked great. I didn't really respond as well to bent over rows with a bar. I didn't like cable rows. But I was like, I know the ones that work for me. I'm just hammering away at these and they're building my back. If it came to, squatting, and I said, the things that work for me, pause high bar squat, front squats for volume, hack squats, safety bar squats, these things all always contribute well to my strength. And so if I know that, but you don't like that, I might be dissuaded if I'm not like confident in my own training strategy. But if I get away from the things that I know work because they're not as commonplace, you just missed out.
Well, the key thing is you arrived at those by doing a bunch of other things.
Yeah.
So how did you know that those were the things that actually had correspondence?
Well, sometimes you just know. Like I spent a lot of time in my life doing shrugs to get my traps to grow.
Yeah.
And you get a pump. I would never, ever wake up the next day with sore traps. And then I did, for the first time, power cleans. And I woke up the next day and my traps were like super tight. And I was like, yes, finally figured this out, and so I was like, I'm going to do these at least every week. And, they just worked for a long time. Power cleans are underrated. When you're in your 20s and you need to gain in your teens, power cleans were the single biggest mass gaining exercise for me. It was like most years I could gain 10 to 15 pounds. I started doing power cleans when I was 19. I gained 25 pounds in like 10 months. My bench went up, my dumbbell presses went up. It was awesome. I finally had some traps. It's like, and it's like, I also find it hilarious. Starting strength is a really common, like training program that a lot of people latch onto, and people will argue with you about it, how great it is. But at the same time, I almost never see people doing the cleans, which was part of the original design. So it's like you're telling me how great it is, but you just happen to sub out kind of one of the main things, because for whatever reason. So I'm like, okay, well, maybe, you've got other stuff that works. That's great. But yeah, I think that's the thing. You have to kind of try enough stuff to figure out what works. Like for me, for deadlifting, I learned how to do deficit deadlifts, and it was like, these work. I feel like it's the magic exercise that works for everybody. But again, it's like, do you want to do that?
Yeah.
It's like most people don't.
Yeah. No, they
Not
suck.
fun.
Yeah, they
Not
suck.
fun.
And that may be part of the reason why they work, because it's developing that mental toughness,
It's
to be able to pull.
It's just one of those things where it's like, you're like, what's the secret? You're like, here's the secret. And you're like, how about a different secret?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, sorry.
Cable row. Something that's a little bit easier.
Yeah. Now it's not to say that if you always just make things harder, that it's better. Some things are harder because that's stupid.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you're like, I want to build my deadlift and I'm not going to use chalk. It's like, well, you're not building your deadlift. You're just building your grip strength. Your deadlift form is going to change if you can't grip the bar properly when you're trying to pull hard. That's harder, but not better.
Yeah.
Or if you squat and the bar is just whipping around everywhere, and you don't have a belt on, it's like, if you really need core strength, that might be helpful. But if it's teaching you to kind of shift your weight, in a way that's not the best way to do it, then that might be just figuring out a bad habit to kind of perform like what amounts to now like a circus trick.
Mm-hmm.
So that's you want some variety, but not the circus trick variety. You want kind of harder, but in a reasonable way.
That would be one of the things that I see lifters kind of screwing up. What are some of the other things that you see that lifters could be doing better?
I think a lot of people write off block pulls for deadlifting. So lifting where the weight's kind of in a higher, more advantageous position. So a couple thoughts on that. The height that the bar is from the floor is basically the height of half of a plate. Which is arbitrary. It's like 8 inches or so.
Mm-hmm.
The reason it's 8 inches is because if you did a overhead press and you passed out and you dropped the bar on yourself, you would have a bad day, but you wouldn't be killed, because that's enough space for your head or your body to just get smacked, but not crushed. That has no bearing on doing a deadlift from the floor. So the height is arbitrary. So the idea of changing the heights should just be tool. So if I pull from lower, my back is going to be in a more compromised position. And when I get to the lockout, I'm gonna have to straighten out from a tougher position. Whereas when you pull from a higher position, what this does is gives your legs kind of an advantage, because now you're doing like a quarter squat instead of, let's say, a half squat. But in order to lift that weight, you've got to be able to stabilize your upper body, basically everything from your hips, lower back, upper back. So if you can't sort of, like if you say it was cheating, you just squat the weight up. Well, can you squat the weight up? If you can't, then maybe you need to work on that. For sumo, it was the most helpful exercise of all the things I did, because it taught me how to quickly and aggressively load my hips with a lot of weight. In order to get the weight to move, which is kind of the toughest part for a lot of people, sumo is getting the weight to move. You have to be able to overcome these super maximal weights, but it's only going to feel right if your hips are in the right position. So that was a really good way to strengthen my hip strength, which was lacking. A lot of people in conventional, again, if you took a spectrum, let's say, of back positions, some people on one end of the spectrum will lift with their back extended like a squat. Those people will tend to get stuck on the floor, if at all. If they get the weight moving and their back stays locked, they're locking it out. The other type of person is the person who pulls with the back rounded, maybe uncontrollably rounded, and they're always getting the weight off the floor. The question is, can they straighten out at the top? So for the second type of person who struggles to kind of like brace their back, the deadlift from a block is going to feel awkward and harder for a lot of people. So using a high enough height for conventional where it gives you maybe just a slight advantage, that can be really helpful for the person who struggles to kind of brace their back in a deadlift. So I find it to be very, very helpful for a lot of people. Now, the problem for conventional for most people is not the lack of bracing. It's kind of more just the lack of strength in rounding. So that's where the deficits are really great for most people, I think, on conventional, and the block pulls can be kind of hit or miss. For sumo, I've always found the block pulls to be extremely helpful for most people. Because it's sort of a question of, can you get your hips into a strong position like right at the start? And then you can typically use more weight for more reps, which again, every time you get the weight moving, you've got to put your hips in a strong position. Yeah. So that was a very helpful one for me. But a lot of people just sort of without doing it, they're just like, oh, it's cheating. It doesn't really work. And it's like, well, there's a way to make it work. And just because you don't understand it doesn't mean it's like automatically not valid.
Would you say that would correlate to the partial presses for the bench, or did that not correlate for you?
I don't see it as the same for the bench. I think in the bench, your chest and your triceps are like agonists, like they're both creating power. But in the I think in the deadlift, what you ideally would want is your lower body to create the power and your back to kind of transmit the power. Mm-hmm. So if you can round your back but keep it locked, you can transmit power through that position. And then the question is, if you have enough speed and momentum where when you get to your lockout, can you then extend it?
Yeah.
So, but if you're trying to create the power from your back, I think that's incorrect. So in the bench, I think for raw lifters, I don't usually see the lockout as like the struggle. Mm-hmm. So, and I think creating power in the kind of the sticking point, I feel like a lot of times it comes down to either strengthening the chest, strengthening the back for stability, and then there has to just be a kind of a constant sort of quest for just building volume.
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest thing. And for benching, you can build volume by adding more days too. So adding days where you're adding like kind of a lighter exercise, but maybe, I always like the wide grip benching. Like, Louis talked about mm-hmm. that. I think you got that from Larry Pacifico as, kind of the extra wide benching. And those are things where like, I never really understood this at first, but Louis basically explained it where he said almost like the idea was you're going from 6 sets of 6 at something to then 8 sets of 8 and even to like 10 by 10, which is like, German volume training.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because in one sense of weightlifting, like when you do your main day, the goal is always to put more weight on the bar. Mm-hmm. But the opposite of that is not putting more weight on the bar, but increasing the reps that you can do in a workout. And so if you can go from like, maybe you're benching 100 kilograms for like 6 by 6, and then in a few weeks you're pushing 8 by 8, and then maybe 10 by 10, even if the weight has gone down slightly to do it, you're building in a lot of volume. And that actually is very impactful on your strength. And I think, again, because benching, there's a lot of hypertrophy that's required. Mm-hmm. When I talked to Julius Maddox, he told me he basically organizes his bench around like 2 training in 9-day split. One is kind of your standard day where you're hitting heavy sets. And the other was a day for just doing push-ups. Now he's like 400 pounds. Yeah. So, if you probably have like 2/3 of your weight in your hands when you do a push-up, mm-hmm. and it's still like, 250 whatever pounds. But he told me that when he started, he did 10 sets of 5, and he got up to a point where he did 10 sets of 40. And I was like, okay, so like, the goal is just more. It's not like you're not changing your body weight. It was just building more. And he said that was what, and he might have more, more to say about this, but he told me that was what really exploded his chest strength.
Well, the volumes went from 50 reps.
And he wasn't talking about doing like, full military push-ups, but like just mm-hmm. rapid like reversals in that, half of the range of motion at the bottom. And, I was like, it's funny because sometimes you stumble upon a training method and it works, and you have your eyes open enough to say, hey, this isn't what everyone else is doing, but this works. Mm-hmm. I want to see what I can do with this. And sometimes somebody tells you what to do and you do it, and it's like, okay. So it's interesting because, I know he works with Josh Bryant, and but yeah, that was what he told me. And I was like, that's pretty interesting, because then, I have Louis kind of talking about building up reps on like a rep day, and Julius Maddox doing a day that's the focus is on increasing reps, not weight. And so I thought that was very interesting. So certainly that's something I do like to utilize. Now, it's very common to try to implement like an extra day for more frequency. And the day that you sort of think is like the light day quickly turns into the heavy day.
Yeah.
And now you're doing too many heavy days, and you're going to tank your progress. Mm-hmm. So, if you can sort of fundamentally separate that idea of like the goal of the second day is not to add weight, but it's to like add just workload.
Yeah.
Like that's very interesting. So I kind of went down the same path for a while, and I was like, man, my chest feels great. I was still limited by my tricep, but I was like, it's frustrating to train my tricep, but it's very fun to train my chest. And so it was like, sometimes you got to train the way that you can, not the way that you want to because somebody else is doing, something. So, yeah, but I do have a lot of my lifters do, like a light day where it's like doing wide grip bench or feet up bench or some variation. And, the goal is like 8 sets of 8, it's not to like lift your 3 rep max or anything like that. It's just like, just want to get a huge chest.
What are some other things that you have your lifters do?
I've definitely had, I think as a staple, I think training the lower back at least twice a week is really critical. I think that was something that was not necessarily done or done well when I was kind of starting off. And again, if you train your lower back with heavy deadlifts twice a week, that's probably not going to be sustainable unless you have a very efficient lift. But if you can use like stiff leg deadlifts as the light day, it could still be 60 or 70% of your regular deadlift. But the thing with a stiff leg deadlift, if you're doing sets of like 6 or 8 or 10, as you build fatigue, it's only coming from your hamstrings and back. It's not coming from your quads. So your form doesn't inherently need to change as you go through your sets. So it's very easy to replicate the motion. You can feel the fatigue coming on, and it's easy to push yourself without, going too far. Yeah, I think that's a huge one, is learning how to kind of add those like extra sessions to increase frequency. But yeah, so that's for deadlifting. For squatting, sometimes one of the issues people have will be like one leg getting stronger than the other. And so then I'll have to integrate some more like one-legged squatting. That can, sometimes be pretty helpful. That was really helpful for myself. I think I'd gotten to a point where one of my glutes wasn't really firing well. So the leg mass that I had was taking me out of the hole well on squats. But as I got above parallel to the sticking point, it would feel like both of my quads were working and like my right glute was working and my left glute was like not there. And so I would kind of grind through all my lifts without that sort of, if you lift submaximal weights, you should feel like you gain speed at the sticking point. And then when you get to your max, you're just hoping you can carry the speed through it. But once I started doing the one-legged squats, it kicked the left glute back in and it worked. And specifically because I saw it was always, as I was above parallel that this was happening, I sort of changed my mindset with like these Bulgarian squats to limit the range of motion to always stop right above parallel and not to just dogmatically go as deep as possible because, flexibility is good. And, flexibility is just a thing. It's not the most important thing. So, yeah, I mean, I think for my lifters, what I really want is to get where the form is consistent so that you can increase the volume. I mean, that's kind of the main thing. There's always sort of a cycle of like, a certain amount of heavy lifting that takes place to kind of make sure that you're not doing, if you take a lot of bodybuilders, when they start lifting, they'll have good form for doing reps, but then the form deteriorates when you go to like lift, singles or something like that. So I think there has to be a certain amount of like heavy lifting that takes place. But for me, it's a lot of sets and reps of kind of, bodybuilding sort of accessories. And maybe not like traditional bodybuilding things, but, powerlifting lifts that are done in certain bodybuilding rep formats.
For the volume.
Yeah. Yeah. I find that to be very critical. Deadlifts, a lot of the volume will be like, you do a set from the floor and then you do like 5 sets of 4 of like deficit deadlifts or, you're building volume on these kind of secondary lifts.